Hi, I'm Chris.
I'm Shawn, and this is Weather Booth.
Flirting with around freezing temperatures. Should be relatively dry as we go through the night.
So, what are we talking about today, Shawn?
Well, today, in my section, we're going to talk about the early history of tornado forecasting and warnings. So that should be pretty interesting.
It's very interesting. Didn't they just how did they even do it back in the day?
I know. It's like, hey, look, there's a tornado. That's pretty much how it was for most of human history. So let's dig right into it. So, as I said, in that joke, it actually was, for the most part, that's how tornadoes were forecasted and warned back in the day. They were just observed, and that's about it.
I've never seen one, but there's always a chance. Weather Bureau wouldn't issue a tornado alert without some good reason. Operator, this is an emergency call. I want the Elmville Weather Bureau, Main 2100.
But it wasn't until the mid-20th century that the network of communications allowed for some forecasting to be done. So, for the most part, weather offices wouldn't even know about tornadoes until after they had occurred, once eyewitness accounts had reached their offices to record those instances. So by the second half of the century, weather radar was the first major step in allowing the preemptive warnings for tornadoes. So though even these radars were only capable of detecting the outlines of storms and couldn't actually see any rotation within them. So specifically, I'm going to talk about the first successful tornado forecast, which occurred on March 25th, 1948. So this episode's going live right around the end of March, so just in time with another almost today in history for weather. So this thing happened, as I said, this outbreak happened on March 25th, 1948. And the forecast was made by United States Air Force Captain Robert C. Miller and Major Ernest Fallbush. 5 days prior to this tornado outbreak, another outbreak of storms had hit central Oklahoma. And the poor forecasts that had taken place on that outbreak in particular have resulted in disarray and confusion, and ended up costing a lot of damage. That's a lot of damage. So for that first storm, which happened on March 20th of that year, thunderstorms were beginning to approach Oklahoma City around 9:30 that evening. The forecast for that evening had originally said that it was going to be dry, so it was already completely wrong from what reality ended up being. And forecasters at Will Rogers Airport in Oklahoma warned the Tinker Air Force Base that they were in line with the approaching storm. And a mere minutes before the storm struck, there was a quick signal sent out to the men on the base saying that, quote, tornado south on moving northeast. And as I said, a few minutes later, they were hit by the tornado and $10 million in damage. So
that's a lot of damage.
The really bad warning had led to a great amount of damage. And the agency was like, we need to work on this. There's some, we need to find a pattern into how to actually give a good forecast and give preemptive warning to the military. This was mainly for the military, by the way. Civilians weren't really the main target demographic yet. In the wake of that storm, which had the terrible forecasting, Miller and Fallbush were tasked by their superiors to consider methods for forecasting tornadic thunderstorms. And over the next 3 days, the two would study over charts from previous tornado outbreaks to try to piece together patterns that were prevalent during and prior. At the time, tornadoes had been studied to a very limited degree, so their formation process was pretty much entirely unknown at the time. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, military radars were which had originally been used during World War II for other reasons, were now starting to be used for weather forecasting, but they were as I mentioned earlier, limited to the outlines of these storms, and we couldn't see into the storm to see the dynamics such as rotation. So after looking at upper air analysis and surface observations from the March 20th storm, Miller and Fallbush concluded that the central Oklahoma region was due again for another tornado outbreak on March 25th. So imagine just like delving into the data for 3 days and like, oh wow, I have to apply it now 4 days later. So definitely having to work under pressure. But technically it would be low pressure. So anyway, so on March 25th, Miller and Fallbush were tasked with issuing a severe thunderstorm forecast, as well as the first tornado forecast based on their analysis that they had done over the previous few days. Their superior had instructed them to make those two forecasts, and they were actually reluctant to make it because they weren't completely confident in their findings. But anyway, at 2:50 that afternoon, they released their statement, like putting out their tornado warning for that evening for central Oklahoma. And at 6 o'clock that evening, a tornado struck Tinker campus 5 days after it had already been struck by a tornado. So, like, what are the chances of that? But
tornado hitting twice, or two tornadoes hitting the same spot.
yeah, like, you thought
That's rough.
hitting was insane? Try a tornado. So anyway, so while the storm was happening, Miller actually, towards the end of the day, was like, I don't think this is actually going to pan out. I think our forecast was wrong. So he actually left the office and was driving home when he heard over the radio that a tornado was currently on the ground and heading towards Tinker Base. And so I guess sometimes it pays to have confidence in your forecast. So
It really does.
yeah, so by issuing that forecast, it actually saved a lot of lives at the campus. And though they haven't started rebuilding from the previous storm, it also saved some damage costs. So after the outbreak, Miller and Fallbush took a year off from forecasting. So it wasn't until 1949 that they would continue issuing tornado warnings. After they had become acquainted with like the patterns and their analysis was getting more solidified, they began distributing their tornadic forecasts to the American Red Cross and the Oklahoma Highway Patrol. And in the early 1950s, there began to be conflict over whether or not the military or civilian agencies should have the jurisdiction to make such tornado warnings. And the first official tornado warning was made in 1950, and the first tornado watch was made in 1952. So that's how the first successful tornado forecast was made.
Did those meteorologists forecast or put those tornado warnings out that you were just talking about?
Actually, no, because those two were actually not tornado. They weren't meteorologists. They were just a part of the Air Force. They weren't meteorologically background, but they still had enough of like an interest and understanding that, at least for the initial few storms they did. But I'm not sure if the first actual official tornado warning was issued by them.
Yeah. It's really interesting to me how the first tornado warning occurred 2 years prior to the first tornado watch. I guess it's weird to watch history unfold now in 2021 now. So
yeah, and random tidbit, the first actual rudimentary tornado forecasting began in 1885 and was started by a guy named John P. Finley. But 2 years after he like began issuing these tornado forecasts, he, along with some other guys, decided like, hey, we shouldn't actually use the word tornado in our forecasts because it'll be bad for businessmen and it'll instill fear in the public. So from the 1880s all the way until 1938, local agencies, as well as the predecessor to the National Weather Service, they were not allowed to use the word tornado in their forecast for that very reason of worrying that it would be instilling fear in the public.
That's incredible. Not really incredible. That's kind of sad. But
yeah.
I'm glad to live in a time where we can forecast tornadoes pretty well, actually.
So, Chris, what are you talking about today?
It's a great question. I would like to talk about more modern. So, as we know, in recent weeks, the Southeast has been getting slammed with severe weather. And over the past 2 weeks, there have been 3 cases of severe weather. First case occurred between March 16th and March 18th of 2021. and this affected regions of Mississippi and western Alabama. Associated with this severe weather, there were 48 confirmed tornadoes as of today, and unfortunately, at least 6 injuries and 1 fatality are related to this severe weather event. The second case occurred on March 24th through 26th, and this affected the same regions of eastern Mississippi, Alabama, and this time including Georgia. As of last night, there were 11 confirmed tornadoes, including at least 1 EF3 and 1 EF4 tornado. And unfortunately, so far, there are 6 fatalities and 2 injuries as of this recording. And a third severe weather case is occurring today, right during this recording on March 27th. This is going to affect regions in northern Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee. This is 3 different severe weather events that have affected virtually the same region in the past 2 weeks. What is causing this? Why is it only affecting one area? This is something that can be explained on the weather booth. So first, let's define some severe weather terms. Generally, when we think of severe weather, we think of supercells. Supercells are a special kind of thunderstorm, which, unlike most thunderstorms, do not have a time scale given the right conditions. Supercells are also embedded in what we call a rotating mesocyclone. Think of a mesocyclone as a circulation within a storm. Mesocyclones in supercells can spawn tornadoes. And in addition to the threat of tornadoes, supercells may also contain severe winds, large hail, and very heavy rain. So, what causes these supercells? There are 3 main ingredients needed in order for there to be potential for supercells. First, we must have wind shear, which is defined as a change in wind speed or direction with an increase in elevation. Secondly, there must be moisture present. And finally, there must be instability in the atmosphere. An unstable environment is an environment where air from the surface is most likely to rise because it is less dense and or warmer than the air around it. This eventually forms clouds and, if strong enough, thunderstorms. Let's take a look at a few maps. These first few maps I'm about to show describe wind shear. On this map, we are looking at winds near the surface on March 17th, which is one of the days where severe weather occurred. I will be using maps from this severe weather case to explain supercell formation. The wind speed is denoted in the blue shading on this chart, and the wind direction can be denoted with the icons that appear on the page. At this time, as denoted by this arrow, the wind is blowing from the south, which brings warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico into the region. Now, we are looking at the winds at the 500 hectopascal level, or between 5 and 6 kilometers above the surface. Notice the significant shift in wind direction this time. The wind is not from the south, but it is from the southwest. If we put these 2 maps together, we can see a significant shift in wind direction. This is called directional wind shear. While it is not as obvious on these maps, the wind speed is also stronger higher in the atmosphere than it is near the surface. This is called speed wind shear. The reason that wind shear is important for forecasting tornadoes is because a change in wind and height is the key ingredient in tornado formation. Wind shear causes rotation in the atmosphere, which can be measured as vorticity. We will get a little more into this later. As noted previously, the southerly wind into the southeast generally brings warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico into the region. Meteorologists measure moisture in the atmosphere by a quantity called precipitable water, which is a measure of the amount of precipitation that could possibly fall on your location based on the amount of water vapor in the column of air above you. The green, blue, and purple regions on this map show higher values of precipitable water. This map simply supports the claim that there is a moisture being brought into the southeast from the Gulf of Mexico on March 17th. While wind shear and moisture are obviously important variables to consider when forecasting severe weather, Instability is the icing on the cake. Meteorologists can view instability nicely through what's called a Skew-T diagram. Essentially, we are looking at a plot of the temperature, which is the red line, and dew point, the green line, from the surface all the way up far into the atmosphere and even the stratosphere. Pressure is plotted in a vertical direction, but we can simply think of the vertical direction as height for the purpose of this video. In the x direction, temperature is plotted, but these lines are skewed to the northeast, parallel with the bright blue line that represents 0 degrees Celsius. Finally, the dashed line that is near the red temperature line is called the air parcel path. This is the path that air would follow if it were to rise in the atmosphere. For the purpose of this segment, we can ignore every other line. Earlier, we defined instability in the atmosphere as one that is deemed favorable for air to rise. This is achieved when temperatures decrease rapidly with height, which is the case in this Skew-T diagram. In this particular case, the parcel path appears to the right of temperature, indicating that the parcel path that air would follow would be warmer and less dense than the actual temperature of the environment. Since less dense air will rise above more dense air, this parcel path is favorable to keep rising. The area between the parcel path and a temperature, that is shaded in red, is a measure of instability called CAPE. In this sounding, the CAPE is generally uninterrupted as an air parcel rises through the atmosphere. This indicates that the environment is unstable, favoring the formation of clouds and potentially thunderstorms or supercells if combined with the other two variables. An unstable environment is what may ultimately form supercells and tornadoes. Instability is what can disrupt the environment and tilt a rotating vorticity tube that's caused by wind shear, which can lead to mesocyclones, supercells, and potentially tornadoes. What I had just explained is only a small fraction of what is considered in the severe weather forecast. This next map, drawn every few hours by the Storm Prediction Center, or SPC, evaluates general severe weather risk from a marginal risk in the light green to extreme risk in pink. The pink area generally combines the biggest risk in severe weather because the combination of wind shear, moisture, and instability in that region is most favorable to create supercells. Lastly, I wanted to show reports of the storm damage that occurred across the region on this day, with red indicating tornado reports, blue indicating wind reports, and green indicating hail reports. Most of the tornado occurred in Alabama, where the most widespread wind reports were across the region of Mississippi. Overall, this was a very significant storm. Any severe weather event puts humans at risk of injury or death. Thus, it is vitally important for not only meteorologists to forecast these accurately, but for people to head to safety when faced with a severe weather warning of any kind. Shawn, back to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. A very interesting segment, especially talking about more recent storms that had developed earlier this month.
Mm-hmm. You see, I was originally going to do just a severe weather case on that day, but as the severe weather, it's been relatively the same pattern over the past 2 weeks or so. It's very interesting. It's the same areas that keep getting affected, which is really, really bad.
So that concludes this week's episode of Weather Booth. So what did we talk about today? Well, I talked about the early history of tornado forecasting and the warning system.
I talked about the formation of supercells and the pesky variables you need in your environment to form supercells.
Yeah, that was pretty interesting. I'm glad you talked about that, Chris.
I mean, we didn't know about these variables until what, the 1950s. So I mean, it's really important, and meteorology has improved a lot since the first tornado forecast. So it's come a long way.
And there's always room for improvement. So
absolutely. That concludes this episode of the Weather Booth. Thanks for watching, folks, and tune in next week.
Goodbye.